Welcome, everyone. We're back with episode 10 in our Practice Makes Progress series. And what we're talking about is spiritual practices. Why don't you, Cyril, tell us what it's about?
So really what this is all about is, the whole idea of these practices is really to help us put Jesus at the center of our lives and ultimately to really be formed by Jesus.
Right. Because we're formed by lots of things.
We are.
Our culture, our family, or whatever. And this is sort of a reset.
Yeah, and a lot of it is also about just really being intentional in that. Like I think sometimes we think just because we have nice thoughts about Jesus, we'll be formed by him. Yeah, exactly. And it is making sure we're putting these simple practices into our lives, and more we're becoming more and more like Jesus in that. And so a lot of it is about, because it takes some time, a little bit. It doesn't need to take lots of time, but it does take some. It's a lot of times it's surrendering to Jesus, giving up some of our natural tendencies to want to be in control.
Ouch. Yep.
And so we've gone over things like prayer, and we talked about reconciliation. We've talked about rest and Sabbath. And today we're talking about 3 practices. They are passing shalom, generosity, and service. So why don't we jump in with passing shalom?
This one is very closely related to the reconciliation one you talked about.
Very much so, yeah.
So when we say what is passing shalom, well, depending on your religious tradition, it may have been included in your liturgy or your service. It would come right after the message and before communion. And a lot of times it took the form of saying things like peace of Christ to you or peace of the Lord to you. And it was just a verbal exchange between people that was sort of casual to each other prior to taking communion together. However, in her book, The Liturgy of Ordinary, Trish Harrison Warren says that passing the peace has a much deeper and richer context. She claims it's the small opportunities in everyday life to extend kindness, grace, and forgiveness, and to seek reconciliation. And I think she gave the example of having an argument with her husband.
Yeah.
And who was going to be the first one down to what she called lay down the sword and start reconciling. So again, it might look like that for you. Be the first one to apologize after an argument. It might just be refusing to hold a grudge, or just offering grace to those people in your life that are maybe awkward or even annoying.
And I think it's really important to notice the idea of, passing the shalom and being like letting this be a regular thing in life is because I think when we talk about, and I'm sure even if you watched the video on reconciliation, quite often it's the big things in life that come to our mind. And yes, absolutely, we ought to practice it in those things. This one is really talking about the very little things that happen in life. That obviously over time can build up or anything like that, but it is these kind of like daily practices, and I mean for sure her using the example of argument with her spouse, which, let's face it, is a thing that happens.
It does.
And just the idea of just even those little things, everyday things that happen, doesn't mean it's a big argument. Just an argument, and just like, whatever, apologizing, like, I didn't really fully listen to what you said. Just little things that are there. It becomes a regular thing that we're doing in everyday things that happen, everyday relationships.
And I think you said something really important there, is so that it doesn't build up. So when we do let them build up, sometimes they can begin to fester a little bit, and then we start being resentful of the other person. Yeah. And so this is a way to overcome that, I guess. And in the book, she says that early Christians were so intent on ensuring that the passing of the peace was a time of real reconciliation and not a mere formality, that in 3rd century Eastern churches, a deacon would stand up during the passing of the peace and say, "Is there any man that keepeth aught against his fellow?" We don't really talk like that anymore. No. So we're asking, is there anybody that has, is at odds or with their anybody else that is in the community? And I think Jesus taught this very same thing in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5. If we read from verse 23 and 24, it says, "So if you are presenting a sacrifice at the altar in the temple, and you suddenly remember that someone has something against you, leave your sacrifice there at the altar and go and be reconciled to that person. Then come and offer your sacrifice to God. Now, I'm sure to Jesus' audience, that sounded totally absurd.
Yeah.
I mean, people had traveled miles to Jerusalem to make sacrifices at the temple, along with thousands of others at the appointed time. And you can just imagine the long lineups there were to get to make your sacrifice. And Jesus is saying, when you finally get there at the altar, and if you remember something that you're at odds with someone, leave your sacrifice at the altar and go and be reconciled.
And I think it's really important to notice, even, we can really think through the idea of we're at odds with someone because of what someone has done to me.
Yeah.
And definitely that can be encompassed in here.
Yeah.
But here you hear Jesus, he's saying someone's had an issue with you. So maybe you've done something.
Yeah, something wrong, yeah.
And it
goes both ways. Yeah.
It really is also looking into ourselves of where we need to bring some of that peace and like, you know what, I think I messed up here.
Yeah.
Kind of moment.
And forgiveness and reconciliation are that important to Jesus and the kingdom of heaven that he would ask you to wait in line twice to make your sacrifice. If we can, we always also find it in the Lord's Prayer.
Yeah.
Again, in part of the Sermon on the Mount. This is chapter 6 now. Jesus says, pray like this: Our Father in heaven, may your name be kept holy. May your kingdom come soon. May your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And give us today the food we need. And forgive us our sins as we have forgiven those who sin against us. And don't let us yield to temptation, but rescue us from the evil one. And then he goes on and sort of highlights that point. If you forgive those who sin against you, your heavenly Father will forgive you. So Jesus is making our forgiveness from God dependent on us forgiving others.
Yeah, and again, moving to the whole idea of when Jesus is teaching this prayer, there's definitely an element that this is understood to be something daily.
Yeah.
And so again, this idea,
this was a daily prayer.
This practice is something that we are constantly just sort of every day doing. It's, like, hey, is there a place I need to forgive someone? And just where is that and all that sort of, and having that maybe a reflective moment, whatever that might look like in your life, to do that and then go and practice that.
That's a little bit reminiscent of the other podcast we did about interior reflection.
Very much so.
Where we might, if we just carry on with life and be distracted all the time, we might not take the time to actually say, oh, what have I done to really, why is my relationship with that person not the way it should be? Oh, maybe it's something I've done. And so that works in with that. You see how some of these practices are very interrelated.
Yeah. And I think it's just to understand too, just as we say this, we're not saying that that's going to be an easy thing, in all situations, and to take care when it comes to do that. In some cases it may take some time to get to that point, and maybe there's some healing involved as well. And so just definitely, it's not just sort of like, oh, go do it necessarily. In all cases, there are probably many cases where you can do that, but yeah.
Okay, let's jump into generosity then. In our recent financial series, we talked about getting our finances under control so that we are living in a way that we spend less than we make. And I know that's a process for most of us, or lots of us. It took me several years to get my finances arranged so I could live this way. But once we are there, it does open up opportunities for us to be generous. And what I mean by that in this case is to give away some of our resources.
Right.
In Acts 20 and 35, Jesus is saying, this is my last gift to you, this example of a way of life. So generosity is to be a way of life. A life of hard work, a life of helping the weak, a life that echoes every day those words of Jesus our King, who said, it is more blessed than to receive. It is more blessed to give than to receive. Important to get that right. So in this case, I would like to say that in my experience, when I practice generosity, it brings me joy. I think it's partly because of the joy I'm bringing to other people when I share with them.
Sometimes it's when you just that simple act of generosity. Yeah. It is kind of when someone's just very appreciative of it.
Yeah.
It's really great to see that appreciation.
So let's not
and how
deny
much-
that it's a blessing to receive.
Yeah.
And I think partly because we join with God in his mission to help other people learn to follow Jesus by blessing them. I know in my experience, again, through generosity and getting to know people, which generosity opened the door for that, I've been able to share about Jesus. So again, I think that's two ways it brings us joy.
Yep.
And John Mark Comer, in his book, Practicing the Way, which is all about spiritual practices, says the church should be a community of contentment in a culture of consumerism through the practice of generosity. He then asks, what do you have to give? Or put it another way, how badly do you want joy? So I think this is one of the things that we talked about many times before, is our brains are wired to be run on joy, and this is one of the ways that we can experience it.
I think it's really important to note too, even though finances play a part in this, we need to say that generous is an all-encompassing kind of way. It's not picking the one way to do it. It's really is how do we do it in all the ways. We can be generous with our time.
Yeah.
We can be generous with our talents or giftings in certain things. And it's just kind of like finding those things to where that might be. And really, if we are doing this as a general practice, it'll encompass all of those things.
Absolutely. Now, when specifically talking about giving of our resources now, how do we do generosity? And before we get into some practical ways to do that, I think I just wanted to note that if we're being generous, but we give with the expectation that the person being given to will give back to me equally what was given, that's not really generosity.
No, it's transactional.
It's transactional. And Jesus talks about this in Luke 14. Jesus was invited out to dinner by one of the Pharisees, and then Jesus, turned to his host. He says, when you put on a luncheon or banquet, he said, don't invite your friends, brothers, relatives, and rich neighbors, for they will invite you back, and that will be your only reward. Instead, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the blind. God will reward you for inviting those who could not repay you. Right. So let's go on and look at some examples. Again, some of these are not just financial, as you said, but we could just offer to pay for lunch, coffee, dinner, buy tickets to an event we know someone likes, bring donuts or treats to work or a social gathering, even if it's not your turn. Help someone less fortunate than you. And again, this could be in the way of just being present with them or giving of your talent, whatever that might be. I would suggest that, again, in the financial series, we talked about that we should financially support the church you attend and other worthwhile charities doing work that you're concerned about. So just an example, for me, I support International Justice Mission. My wife and I are very concerned about slavery in the world and the work that IJM does. And the way they report it, I really like that. I get a monthly newsletter saying what work they've done and how many people they've helped during the month. And I sponsor a child as well. That's done that for many years. I also sponsor the Bible Project because I really appreciate their the content they generate that's free for people, and it just helps so much with Bible study. So, what you talked about.
Yeah.
Anything you wanted to add to that list?
Well, no, I do many of the same things, and I think what's really important though is we don't go to a place where we just kind of give. The idea eventually we run out.
We run out, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, yes, it is a sacrifice, and that there is that. It's also, but it isn't. It's okay that we're not doing it in such a way that we're really, really maybe putting ourselves at a disadvantage.
Yeah.
In sense, like you pay your bills. That's good to do that. Like this.
Absolutely, and I think I've often heard this verse quoted as it's better to give than to receive, and that's not what Jesus said. He said it's more blessed to give than to receive. So I think the implication here is that God blesses us with more when we give. he trusts us to partner with him in his mission to help the poor and the weak and the needy. And it says in Luke 6:38, give and you will receive. Again, this is sort of the Sermon on the Plain, which is similar to the Sermon on the Mount that Jesus is giving. He says, give and you will receive. Your gift will return to you in full, pressed down, shaken together to make room for more, running over and poured into your lap. The amount you give will determine the amount you get back. Now, payment often was made in Jesus' time through resources. In this case, a measure was essentially a bag that you poured wheat into.
Right.
When the bag was full, you could get more in it if you shook the bag a little bit and then pressed it down, get the air out of there. And I think lots of times people didn't necessarily do that. They just filled the bag to the top and gave it to you. And Jesus is saying through this verse, which we may not understand from what he's saying, is that God will give you back more when you're being generous and not giving just to get more for yourself. And again, I think that's the idea, is not to give to the point of exhausting your resources, but to be generous in a way where we see more blessing, and then that may allow us to give more down the road. But the idea is to, I think we pray this in the posture prayer, to live with open hands, not to try and grasp it for ourselves, but to meet our own needs and pay our own bills and take care of our own stuff, but then in the excess to be able to help other people.
Yeah, and I think it's also in that is just to remember, this is not, as much as, yes, it's sacrificial and it will cost and things like that, it is not somehow a way of saying, like, let people take advantage of me.
Yeah, or take a vow of poverty. We're not saying those things at all. All right, let's jump into the last one today, which is service. Jesus modeled life of service to others as kind of the norm for the kingdom of heaven.
Yeah.
Another Bible verse here, Matthew 20:24-28. When the 10 other disciples heard that James and John had asked, they were indignant. They asked to sit at Jesus' right hand in the kingdom of heaven. But Jesus called the disciples together and said, you know the rulers of this world lord it over the people, and officials flaunt their authority over those who are under them. But among you it will be different. Whoever wants to be a leader among you must be your servant, and whoever wants to be the first among you must become your slave. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve others and give his life as a ransom for many. And I think our default, our nature is the exact opposite. Most of us would much rather be served than to serve.
Sure, I think a lot of people can be like that. Yeah.
And our culture is a reflection of that.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely speaks against the idea of entitlement. No matter what you are, as celebrated as it might legitimately be, you worked hard and you do a great job and all that sort of stuff. It's just, but the idea is still, no matter what seat you are at the table, that you are still a servant.
Exactly.
How can I be of service to the people around me?
Yeah. And John Mark Comer in his book again says, think of the raging epidemic of injustice in our modern society. The racism, the bigotry, the political polarization, or the growing chasm of inequality between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots. How do we possibly heal those wounds? He says that we serve. And I think this can be closely related to passing the peace many times, and often with the people closest to us. When we have conflict, our tendencies to escalate. We bring up something that happened in the past, or we take a known behavior. We know they're like this, but we choose that moment to throw it in their face, or worse, we give them the silent treatment or avoid them, which is much more active than passive, where this could actually be an opportunity to serve the other person, not by escalating, by not escalating, and maybe to look to resolve whatever the issue is. Now, point of contention for me with my wife at home, we split up the chores at home, and I'm not always the most diligent to clean the downstairs bathroom, which is mine. And I think she usually kindly reminds me. Sometimes if it's gone more than a week or so, it's not so kind. And I think in this case, just doing the thing ahead of time would just avoid the conflict altogether. And I think that's there's where being a servant and looking over the other person's needs, because it's very important to her, and it really isn't that important to me, if I'm honest. So there's a story about Jesus found in the Gospel of John, chapter 13, and this is just before Jesus' last meal with his disciples. Jesus intentionally takes a position culturally lower than that of his disciples. He was the rabbi, they were the students, so he was normally in a position of authority over them. And what does he do? He washes their feet, which is something only a servant or a slave would do. And then he says, after he's done this, I have given you an example to follow. Do as I have done to you. Now that you know these things, God will bless you for doing them. So John Mark Comer, I think, wraps up the chapter on service again very well by saying, here's a key truth. Not only does the practice of service have the potential to mend our fractured world, it has the power to mend us. This is one of the most surprising things about the discipline. You think you're there to help others, but you quickly realize you're the one being helped. You're being set free of your ego, your entitlement, your self-obsession. When you serve in the way of Jesus, the lines blur between servant and served, giver and recipient. Both give and both receive. Dignity is restored in one, freedom is won in the other. So let's just take a minute. We have a couple of minutes before we come to the end here and sort of just hit some of the highlights of what we talked about today.
Well, yeah. So we've talked about the idea of passing shalom, and just taking small opportunities in everyday life to extend kindness, grace, forgiveness, and seek reconciliation. Again, these aren't necessarily the big things.
Yep.
The idea of forgiveness is very much idea connected to God, and it's really God shows it and we model it as we interact with others and whatnot. And so there's a dependence on that, because it is very much a characteristic of God that he wants us to extend.
Yeah. And I think you mentioned it as well, that it's in the Lord's Prayer as a daily thing that we seek. So generosity, we talked about, is living in a way that we spend less than we make, which opens up opportunities to be generous, to give some of our resources and our talents and our time away without any expectation of return from the one we're giving to.
Right. And we can partner with God in his mission by supporting the church that we're attending, and support also charity works that we can feel passionate about. Again, like you mentioned, IGM, which is about ending slavery in our world. It's a great thing to just give a little bit of money to, and that we're hopefully seeing literal freedom for some people. Yeah,
and our church 2 or 3 times a year packs lunches for the homeless, and that's a thing we do as a community. And again, we're trying to practice this as a church as well as individually. And lastly, Jesus modeled life of service to others as the norm for the kingdom of heaven, which is, as Jesus said, is here and now. And again, I think the way John Mark Comer, I know we read that big long thing, but if we just go to the end where it's service, both give and both receive, but dignity is restored in one and freedom won in the other. It benefits the giver and the one being given to.
Well, if you as you've been listening to this, and hopefully maybe it's spurred some thoughts, maybe you're just feeling encouraged because you can see yourself practicing some of these things, and we just want to encourage you to keep doing that. Like anything, like any of the practices we're doing, it's not about bigness. When we talk about generosity, it's not about like how many, hundreds or thousands or whatever, dollars or time or whatever to give. It really is just adding that simplicity into life. It's great to start small. You just, if you're out with a friend, just say, hey, I got that coffee. Yeah. You just something similar, like it's just little things like that, and just what that means. It doesn't mean you have to buy every coffee by any stretch of the imagination. But just little things like that of service. Sometimes it's seeing a friend who's lifting something heavy and to say, oh, hey, I can help you with that, and just little things like that that good chance we're doing is just making sure we're just making ourselves intentional in doing those things. So thank you once again. We hope that you are encouraged by some of the things you're hearing and understand that these are ways to which we can practice these spiritual things and be more like Jesus in our everyday walk of life. If we really like doing sort of stuff. So what's really helpful is if you like this video and subscribe to the channel, so we can just keep talking more about content like this. Thank you so much. We will see you next time.